Are we ready?
I'm ready.
Should we go?
No, the rules are once friend gets here, we can start.
What?
The rules are once friend gets here, we can start.
All right, Fred, are you here now? You were here and left before.
My pen was not actually.
Well, I'm,
You're not going to use any high frequency words and stuff,
I'm using the easy words from the easy hard list.
I'm delighted to be able to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Remez and I have a lot in common with each other. Of course, one of the more obscure facts that we have in common is that we both know Kathy Power. Dr. Remez was a student at Brandeis when Kathy Power was in the Weather Underground. And I was a professor at the University of Oregon and used to eat in Kathy Power's restaurant when she ran it in Oregon under an assumed name. However, we actually have a lot more in common. Dr. Remez, as I said, got his undergraduate degree at Brandeis University. And then from there he went to the University of Connecticut, where he worked with Michael Turvey, who actually is going to come and speak in psychology at the end of this month. He worked at Haskins Laboratory then and began a series of very interesting studies that sort of characterize one of the ways that he has been important to our field. Dr. Remez is a burster of balloons. Much in the spirit of Rabelais and Swift, in his dissertation work, which is really legendary in the field, he helped the field to come to grips with the fact that the selective adaptation paradigm in speech perception was in fact flawed and undercut the whole basis for arguing that there were phonetic detectors in speech perception. Subsequently, in many other arenas, he has, through insightful work, including the work he's going to tell you about today, but in other domains as well, has managed to show that simple assumptions that people had about the way speech is perceived, about the way signals are processed and sorted out in the environment and whatnot, are rather misleading. And he's done this for perceptual magnets, among other things, and also indeed for the kind of auditory streaming stuff that people like Bregman have talked about. He served in many roles in the field. He has been editor of two important journals that publish speech research, Perception and Psychophysics, associate editor there, and also associate editor currently at the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance. He's also served on a number of grant panels, has been chair of his department, and with all these administrative responsibilities, he has still managed to find time to do very interesting work. So without further ado, I turn it over to Robert. The title of his talk is Perceptual Requirements for Organizing and Analyzing Speech, or Perceiving a Message and a Messenger in Time-Varying Terms.
Well, thank you, Peter. When you described all of the service that I've done as editor and as chair, I realized that if I had only kept my head down and gotten my work done, I'd have been able to keep up with you better. So for that reason, I'm only going to talk about the studies that I've done, not the ones that I wanted to do, but couldn't do because of my correspondence with the dean or my correspondence with editors, with authors, or with prospective PIs. I'm going to take a kind of survey of the issues and evidence that I've been able to propose to the field in an attempt to make the weaker theory stronger. That's been my objective all along. And the reason to do this is that perhaps these remarks are better addressed to the psychologists than to the engineers, but psychologists, my field would be better if we weren't so bound to normative notions. So what I sought to do with these projects initially was to try to present cases where perception was fine despite the fact that the ingredients, the raw material for perception, was anomalous. That was my goal. In order to pose the problem for my field, how could a listener do so well without specific relevant experience? So that's the big psychological problem. And of course, I think I've got quite a number of cases that show that under certain circumstances, perception succeeds brilliantly, even though it shouldn't, on the assumption that listeners depend on familiar or typical sensory patterns in order to tell what the objects were doing, or specifically who the talker was and what the message was. So let me show you the evidence. So let me pose the questions, show you the evidence, and see what you think of this campaign.
It'll come alive when
Oh, sorry, I'll cover your ears. Sorry. So again, my question from the start has been to pose the question, how does the listener know what the talker just said? And this is a question, I suppose, of speech recognition as opposed to language understanding. The particular motive that a talker might have for saying something like, oh, it's a shame your fiancé was arrested, really doesn't interest me. The crucial question is, what did the talker say to me? What did the talker say to the listener? And there are several ways that I think an explanation takes shape. First, you have to describe a speech signal in a manner that's relevant to perception. And I think that's discoverable, as opposed to a way that's statistically relevant or relevant to a speech therapist. And then we need to describe the ability of a listener to find speech within a noisy world. That's the problem of perceptual organization. The ability to take the welter of sounds that impinge upon the ear and to pull out of it the stream of interest. In contrast to the eyes, this ability is, for the ears, is psychological. When one wants to pay attention to a visual target, you point the eye toward the target so that the portion of the receptor array of maximum density catches the light reflected by that object. There is a region of maximum sensitivity and surrounded by a region of rather poor sensitivity. The ear, on the other hand, is not directional. If you want to pay attention to a particular sound source, it doesn't do you any good to move your head around. What you want to do is to listen for the sounds that issue from that source. And that's a psychological process of attention. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I mean, that's not totally true, right? I mean, it does help move your head to listen to a particular sound. But did someone come over the summer and talk about the way you say that?
Can you hear the man sitting behind you? Yeah? I rest my case. If that weren't true, we would all have died long ago on the savannas of Africa. The ear's omnidirectional. That's why deer, for example, sorry. And then we also need to describe the form by which a signal conveys attributes of the linguistic message and the talker who spoke it. That's the problem of analysis. Once you identify an acoustic or an auditory domain that is coherent, then you start pulling it apart to find the attributes that are relevant to the symbol structure and to a person who is the source of it in the world. Okay? So those are our problems. Now, there are lots of research reports that we've done over the years that describe this. I'm going to mention a few of these. In Perceptual Organization, there was a paper that we published in '94. You know, I'm unhappy with the resolution. Can we just take a time out for 1 second? Let me try to change this. Oh. Sorry, this is the way Macs work for those of you who haven't seen them. Oh, sorry. Let's see if this does better. I may have to restart this. Hang on a sec. Good, this will be better. Good, okay. So the paper in Psychological Review in '94 was a rather exhaustive treatment of the problem of perceptual organization, that is finding a speech signal in an environment that's quiet or noisy. And we've got a paper in Press on bistability of sine waves. I'm going to talk extensively about this synthesis technique that shows that auditory perceptual organization and phonetic perceptual organization may may part company somewhere during the flow of information along the nervous system. For perceptual analysis, we've got a paper submitted now. I'm going to describe today on the analysis of consonants in English. And there's a more elaborate, theoretically overwrought treatment that will appear in a volume edited by Hume and Johnson. And then last, on individual identification, a paper in Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance on the use of phonetic attributes to identify talkers rather than qualitative attributes. So that's the reading list. Okay, so now what's the problem in speech? This shows a spectral analysis of the conventional phonetician spectrogram of the sentence, "The steady drip is worse than a drenching rain." And time runs on the x-axis and frequency runs on the y-axis. And what I've done is I've sort of highlighted some of the raisins in the pudding so you can see the acoustic diversity of a speech signal. That is, there are harmonically excited resonant bands that change in frequency and in amplitude asynchronously. There also are elements like nasal formants that appear and recede from nothing. They are rapid restructurings of the acoustic spectrum. Similarly, frictions associated with the fricatives, both voiced and voiceless fricatives, are rapid restructurings of the signal. And of course, so are consonant releases, which vary in the extent to which they are concentrated or spread throughout the acoustic spectrum. What happens in the case of a speech signal is that a listener, challenged by this diversity of elements, must see or must understand that they represent a single evolving sound attributable to a single source. How does a listener actually do this? Well, let's look at what the majority view is. Element-based. The most prominent account of how an auditory scene is attributed to a variety of sources was proposed by Bregman, and its computational elaboration stems from the Sheffield group led by Martin Cook. And essentially what this says is to take the spectrum incident at the ear and to sort it according to the likeness of the elements. So it requires, first of all, that the perceiver resolve the elements into individual bits of auditory stuff, and then have the perceiver sort these or filter these into piles or streams of like elements. So the bursts go with the bursts, the F1s go with the F1s, the voiced fricatives go with the voiced fricatives, and in fact the single ongoing speech signal is fractured to bits by this view. I can confess to you my alarm during a presentation in Aix-en-Provence when Peter and I were both on the panel to see Martin Cook bound out of the audience waving a view graph and challenging my assertion that his view didn't work, that it was flawed by its initial premise. And of course I wondered for a moment whether he had actually solved the problem. And when I saw that what he was relying on was a computational implementation of Bregman's similarity sorting, I realized that he wouldn't be able to do it. So I said, well, what about a sentence like, "The steady drip is worse than a drenching rain"? And he said, "Give me a couple of years." So that was 1991. Right. So he still can't find the talker. These are hard problems, my friends. Flump, the fuzzy logical model of perception by Massaro, also is an element-based account. It doesn't attempt to sort things into streams. In fact, it assumes that the only sounds that exist in the world are speech. But it does, even in a world where there were a single talker, it would still attempt to find particular elements and to associate those elements by probability with a speech signal. That is, it defines the acoustic elements a priori. Last, I should mention the motor theory of Liberman and Mattingly, which actually is a variant of pandemonium. Pandemonium is an old pattern recognition technique of Selfridge, in which a group of pre-designated elements each compete for incoming sensory information, and whichever one gets the most gets to yell the loudest. What Liberman and Mattingly have claimed is that there's a speech system, and it's rigged up in parallel with all the other pattern analyzers, and whenever a speech signal comes into the ear, the speech mode operates and shuts all the other processing down. The question is, how does this know that it's time to go? Well, they're silent. In fact, the assumption that Liberman and Mattingly make is the same as the assumption that Massaro made. The world consists only of speech produced by a single talker. There is a change-based approach, which is an approach that we've articulated, and we actually convinced Dan Ellis. Do you know him? He ran the auditory list server and did a fabulous thesis with Barry Vercoe, in which he attempted to do a pattern analysis of sounds issuing from a construction site in Cambridge. And he found that under some circumstances, a change-based approach, listening for the way the spectrum varies independent of the elements that undergo the variation, are specific to sound sources. So again, this is the weaker theory. Look at all of those people who are lined up against us. Ellis and me. All right, so how did we actually mount the campaign? We used a technique of copy synthesis called sine wave synthesis. And what we do in sine wave synthesis is we take natural speech. It's just like any other kind of copy synthesis in which you have natural speech and you attempt to derive your synthesis parameters moment by moment from the natural model. Except, instead of using a full spectrum synthesizer that attempts to replicate the broadband harmonically excited formants and the specific spectrum shape, what we do is we find the amplitude peaks in this spectrum and we simply place a time-varying oscillator at that peak throughout the utterance. So what you see in this case is the spectral analysis of the CV syllable ja. And here what we've done is we've shown that this will be the course of the lowest frequency tone. This will be the course of the second lowest frequency tone. This will be the course of the third tone for the vocalic portion. And we're going to use two tones to go through the fricative, because ja has two fricative poles. It's a fricative with a shape like this. Okay? And this is the spectrum of the resulting sine wave pattern. Now, as you would guess, this doesn't sound like speech. And in fact, if we play this sorry, I can play this for you. All right. You have no idea how this is going to go. Let's try.
Where were you a year ago?
That was the natural. Here's the sine wave.
Where were you a year ago? Where were you a year ago? Where were you?
Could you tell what the sentence was? Of course, that was so unfair, wasn't it? Well, what the listeners say when we bring them into the lab and ask them to put headphones on and to tell us what they hear when we play a sentence like that for them. If we bring them into the lab cold and not tell them what they can expect to hear, they don't hear this as speech at all. In fact, they organize this kind of signal the way Al Bregman said they should. They divide the asynchronously varying tones into separate streams, and they say they hear, and the less charitable subjects say this. They blame us for doing the experiment the wrong way. Isn't that sweet? Okay. Of course, when we tell subjects, no, wait a second, we've made synthetic speech in a slightly different way. See if you can tell us what the computer said. Then most of them, let's say 95% of them, 90%, 92% of them, get the hang of it on the first instruction. And they say, where were you a year ago? I can tell exactly. And in fact, we've done lots and lots of experiments to try to find out the conditions specifically under which this is possible and is not possible. And we know that isolated tones, that is the analog of the first formant, the analog of the second formant, the analog of the third formant, are insufficient by themselves. They must be presented concurrently. In fact, what we found is that if they are presented concurrently, we can present one to the right ear and one to the left ear, and the listener will fuse them, despite the fact that they are spatially dissimilar in addition to all of their time-varying dissimilarity. And they will fuse them and report the sentence. Okay. So that was our opening gambit in raising the problem for psychologists to explain what the perceptual requirements are for the organization of a signal. Now, it should be clear that so far I haven't shown you that listeners really do perceive that kind of signal in two ways at the same time. As a set of auditory forms, each associated with a time-varying sinusoid, and as a phonetic form associated with a symbol string. But it should be clear what's at stake here. First, in order to hear each of the tones as separate elements, there has to be a way of keeping them apart. On the other hand, in order to hear these as a speech signal, there must be some point in the auditory representation of the signal that can look at the whole spectrum at once and the way it varies concurrently. And it's that concurrent It's that concurrent variation in the signal that will provide the basis for the elicitation of an impression of the linguistic material. Now, we also did a study to see whether or not in detail this had the same property. I can tell you why. Well, earlier today I was just talking with the graduate students about those processes of perception that are driven by knowledge primarily, in which the intent of the listener is to find sensory support for a hypothetically imagined scenario, whether it's a word or a layout of surfaces. And in our research on sentences, we always gave the listener a sample of sine wave replicated speech that lasted several seconds. They could get the hang of it. And of course, it consisted of a sequence of words as well as a sequence of phonetic segments. And anytime you do that, you are liable to the intrusion of cognitive or a top-down predictive factors to the detriment of the bottom-up analytical component. And the way you can actually remedy that is by posing a test like this one. There are 18 consonants in English that we used, and we paired each of these with the vowel A to make the set of CVs. This is the way we did our natural productions. We had 3 versions of ba, 3 versions of da, 3 versions of ga, 3 versions of pa. That is 3 articulatory instances. And this created a set of 3 times 18, which is something like in the mid-50s of our set of items. And we rolled a syllable down the wire to a subject and said, which of these 18 items did you just hear? We've eliminated lexical context from this kind of procedure, and all that our listener can go on in identifying the consonant is the analytic hearing. That is, the ability to take a sine wave pattern based on the natural spectrum and to identify the consonant that way. For purposes of comparison, we also used natural speech presented in noise. Our first group of listeners were expert at hearing sine waves, and their performance was virtually error-free on an 18 alternative forced choice consonant identification test. We knew we were in trouble right there, because what that meant was that with a little bit of experience, all of our listeners would be able to beat the test. So what we thought we would do is bring my students into the lab and to catch them before they had the relevant experience to be able to perform without error on this test, and to see how good their performance was. We matched the natural performance to this, which was at about 55% correct. We matched the natural performance by presenting speech in noise. So we're going to compare 2 conditions. One in which you get a sine wave CV presented in the clear. The other is one in which you get a natural CV presented in noise. In one case you have, that is in the sine wave case, all you have is the coherent time variation to go on. In the natural case, what you have is the natural timbre to go on. So we're actually asking, does timbre matter? Does auditory quality matter in perception? Now here's the way we scored it. There are, our linguistically oriented colleagues tell us that the consonants of English can be categorized by their place, their manner, and their voicing. There are, how many different, I've got 6 different place values that describe the 18 consonants that we used, 3 different values of manner and 2 values of voicing. So we actually scored each error for the number of features involved in that error. So a single feature error would be to perceive ba as da. A double feature error would be to perceive ba as fa, and a triple feature error would be to well, you get the idea. Here's what we found. Along the x-axis, we have the error type. An error of place, an error of manner, an error of voicing, an error of place and voicing, manner and voicing, or an error along 3 dimensions. And we have the proportion of errors of each type. Here's what happens in the natural case. Okay? So this type of distribution is typical of what Miller and Nicely found in 1955 when they originated the technique. Here's what happens in the sine wave case. What we found was that the error distribution looks exactly the same. And of course, the way you do this is you rank the error types and you do a test of correlated ranks. And in fact, these were far too similar to have occurred by chance. The meaning of this to us, or the point that we argued from this, was that the natural acoustic properties of consonants are not a perceptual requirement for analyzing the speech stream. Being able to follow the coherent variation of a set of non-speech, non-vocal acoustic products is sufficient. So, how does the perceiver know that a sound is speech? By tallying the elements. This requires us to understand whether the elements are available to perception. Our next study is about this, whether they are unique to speech, or by tracking speech-like variation. And if speech-like variation is the key to perceptual organization, we need to ask whether broadband harmonically excited formants are essential to this. Okay, how does a perceiver know that a sound is speech? We're about to publish this paper in which we attempted to see whether a listener has access to the elements of a speech signal. This is an isolated second formant pattern. This is the word from which it is drawn. This is the word shook, and this is the second formant pattern, as you can see. Again, time runs this way, and frequency runs this way. Here's the isolated buzz by itself.
Shoot, 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 shoot.
Hear the word? Okay. Oh, all right, so here's the way we did this test. We had a set of words, and we asked listeners first to tell whether or not the isolated second formants of minimally different words were distinguishable. And what we found was that listeners were fully capable of resolving the frequency pattern of a second formant in isolation. So then we asked whether listeners could analyze this to pull the second formant out and to match it with a second formant presented in the clear. That showed that listeners could not analyze the elements on which their consonant and vowel perception depended. Again, this is a sort of a piece of evidence against the psychological reality of the elementary units that are claimed as the basis for these perceptual accounts. Okay. We then did it in sine waves. Okay. Here's the tone analog of the second formant, and here's the tone analog pattern of the word shook. Here's the tone by itself. Here's the word. All right, here's what we found. In synthetic speech, for isolated second formant patterns, subjects were very good at being able to distinguish them. For being able to hear out the second formant in a synthetic word, subjects were quite poor. In fact, right on 0. Okay? With the sine wave case, we did it in a slightly more interesting way. Because remember, subjects are able to hear sine waves as arbitrary auditory forms unless you tell them that they're listening to synthetic speech. At that point, they begin to hear these things phonetically. So we were able to test the subjects for 2 days with the same words that we had used in the synthetic condition without having them catch on. And as you can see, when the sine wave technique is used to create the words, subjects are quite good at being able to hear the tone, even though, of course, they don't know that these things are words. When we tell them that the sine waves actually compose words, their performance is harmed slightly, but it is still quite good. It's at a D prime of about 1.5. This is, you'd be pleased to do this well. And simultaneously, we ask the subjects to recognize the words. And that, a subsequent study showed that the requirement to recognize the words suppressed this pattern, this sensitivity to the tone pattern slightly. But the point of this project is that in this particular case, subjects are listening to sine wave words in 2 ways at the same time, and they're performing an analysis of both of the aspects of the words concurrently. It's almost as if there are 2 reports out of the auditory system. One report is a report of the auditory form, and that can be subject to a non-speech characterization. There also is a report of the phonetic properties. This has to be considering the whole spectrum, and it can't be lost in the characterization of the elements. That's used to identify the word. This perceptual bifurcation shows that there are, in fact, 2 modes of perceptual organization. One, the auditory mode that Bregman and Cook have been describing, based on the likeness of elements. And the other is a time-varying sensitivity to coordinate change across the whole spectrum. That's the kind of thing that we proposed in our consideration of the intelligibility of sine wave speech. Now, I mentioned at the head of the talk that it's possible to identify a talker from a signal that has no vocal qualities that are natural to talkers. And I think you can see where this is going. What we did, of course, the inspiration for this was that some of the students in the lab said that they were convinced when they heard sine wave signals based on my speech that it was the sine wave talker made his D's exactly the way I do with my New York accent, and that this was a provocative comment, because what it meant was that the level at which the perceptual analysis was occurring was at the detail of phonetic properties that are specific to my dialect or idiolect, rather than at the phonemic level appropriate for, let's say, a lexical representation that represents only the way in which the language creates contrasts among words. So we thought it might be possible to show that in the absence of the vocal attributes that are held to distinguish talkers, that individuals were still identifiable. Now, this was actually a radical departure. Talk about bursting bubbles. If you look at the literature on talker identification, there really is a very clear argument in that literature. It goes something like this. If you want to understand the acoustic correlates of particular individuals, you have to eliminate acoustic properties attributable to specific messages. It should be a durable feature of an individual sound production that don't depend on a particular shibboleth or password, right? You don't have to say swordfish to know that it's me, right? And this stands in direct sort of symmetrical complement to the way in which many people have approached the problem of invariance and variability in speech perception. That is, if you were to look at a sort of classic description of the problem of speech perception, it might go something like this. There are lots and lots of sources of individual variation in the expression of the same word. And in order to identify the word, one must remove all of the attributes that are characteristic of a specific individual articulating the word on a specific instance. So we have this very nice symmetrical theoretical program. A single signal comes in. If you can strip off all the stuff that's characteristic of the individual in the instance, then you can recognize the word. If you can strip off all the acoustic properties that are characteristic of words and messages, then you can identify the individual. Okay. Well, what might these things be? Of course, you know what they are for linguistic properties. That's what I showed in the slide of the steady drip was worse than the drenching rain. It's all of those things that you're supposed to be paying attention to. What do you pay attention to if you want to know who's talking? Well, interestingly, one durable feature of human speech production is the spectrum of the nasal consonants. And that's because you can't change the shape of your nasal pharynx, right? It's always the same shape. Of course, rhinitis notwithstanding, the fact that we're right in allergy season, that should be a clue to the lack of perceptual robustness of that feature. In fact, it turns out that people can't hear those variants very well. So it's unlikely to be providing much information in individual identification. Some other things are the average height and compass of F0, the fundamental frequency of phonation, which is said to characterize the differences among individuals, across individuals regardless of the utterance. Of course, the problem for that approach is that at least in the sine wave case, we leave F0 out. There's no tone that follows the fundamental frequency. So we have at least a condition that can show the necessity of F0. There also are arguments that there are scale differences among talkers in the dimensions of the upper airway, and those determine the frequencies, the central tendency of the frequencies of the vocal resonances. And if you can tell what someone's central tendency is, you might be able to scale talkers. Although if you actually look at the projects that have attempted to characterize the scale differences across individuals, what comes out is that children are small, adults are large, and there's lots of overlap among men and women. So it's not clear that such a dimensional analysis could distinguish males from females, let alone pick you out of the crowd. But we got two good clues that we might be on the right track in this. One from Irv Pollack and the other from Vishnu et al., both of whom had published papers that showed that the variation of formant frequency on statistical grounds could characterize differences across talkers. And it wasn't things like height in the formant plane. It was things like how rapidly or slowly the formant structure was rearranged over the course of continuous speech. So, sorry, I guess I spoke too long. So here's the way we made the test. We had 10 talkers. Each produced the sentence, "The drowning man let out a yell." We had a group of naive subjects come into the lab and listen to a natural utterance produced by talker X And then they were given two sine wave utterances following, one which was produced by talker X and one which was produced by talker Y. And they had to say which utterance, which of these sine wave utterances was produced by the person who said this. They were different instances, by the way. So this sine wave replica was produced by this talker, but it wasn't this natural item that was given as the sample in the test. Here's what a trial sounded like.
The drowning man let out a yell.
That was the natural.
The drowning man let out a yell. The drowning man let out a yell.
Now, could you tell, well, if you had, I guess I should have asked you to listen to these before I put these up. What I hear, sorry.
The drowning man let out a yell.
The drowning man let out a yell.
Listen to the way talker Y spirantizes the D in drowning. She doesn't say drowning, she says drowning. See if you can hear it. Of course, there's no noise anywhere in this. So what you're hearing is the phonetic property without the acoustic or auditory quality. She says the drowning man let out a yell.
The drowning man let out a yell.
Could you hear it?
The drowning man let out a yell. The drowning man let out a yell.
Anyway, you won't be surprised to know that listeners are very good at this, even if they have no prevailing familiarity with these talkers. And in a separate test, we asked people who knew each of the 10 talkers for ranging from 10 to 30 years of casual interaction to do this test from memory, in which instead of getting a natural sample to pick out, they actually got a printed name and were asked to say which of these two were the person who was named. And in most of the, well, this is a scaling solution based on the errors. In general, performance was quite good. The naive listeners always get 8 out of the 10 talkers right. And the listeners who were familiar with the talkers nailed all 10 of them. The male talkers are in the filled bullets and the female talkers are in the open bullets. And what I've done is plotted the scaling solution in this plot frame, and I've superimposed the hierarchical cluster analysis. And what you should see is that these two men were considered the most similar, because they were rarely mistaken for each other. But in the next tier, we pick up this male. But in the tier after that, we get a female. In the tier following that, we pick up a female and a male. In the tier following that, we pick up a female and a male. And then there are two females who are the outliers. What's the significance of this? The men and women are confused for each other because their dialects are similar. Now, because the talkers were members of the research staff of Haskins Laboratories, I can't really tell you what these dimensions are. Dimension 1 appears to be longitude, and dimension 2 appears to be the social desirability of the dialect of English. See why I can't tell you who each of the bullets is? Right, there are some people who have highly undesirable dialects of English, despite the fact that they are quite accomplished. Oh, I could tell you, ask me later. What does this show? It shows that that one of the things that we pay attention to when we listen to each other speak is the phonetic expression of our articulatory habits. We remember these in aggregate, and when they are conveyed by a sine wave representation in the absence of voice quality, we can use that kind of aggregate phonetic experience to tell who's talking. We seem to have a gallery of familiar talkers represented somewhere in memory. And we can identify which one of the talkers we just heard by using a phonetic aggregate description rather than an F0 or a voice quality description. All right, so what are our tentative conclusions? Speech-like variation is sufficient for perception when natural vocal products are absent. Linguistic perception does not depend on typical or familiar acoustic elements, nor on speech-like auditory qualities. Individual perception does not depend on typical or familiar acoustic elements, nor speech-like auditory qualities, just like I said up front. Okay? Now, if it were only me, I would tell you to be careful about accepting these conclusions. So I'm going to tell you about two corroborating cases that work the exact opposite side of the spectrum manipulation. This is one. This is a spectrogram of a sentence that is produced using a technique called noiseband vocoding, in which a natural sentence and the natural sentence in this case is, this demonstration was created by Bob Shannon and colleagues. The speech signal is passed under a filter, and the filter extracts the energy instantaneously. And that estimate of the energy is used to drive a noise source. And the noise source can be either the full spectrum, or it can be this, followed by the whole spectrum, or it can be, in the case that I've illustrated here, there actually are 4 noise bands producing, representing the energy under each band in the natural speech. Now notice, these bands are of stationary frequency. There's no frequency variation in this at all. There's amplitude variation in this band, amplitude variation in this band, and in this band. Amplitude varies asynchronously across these 4 bands. It violates the conditions of element-based auditory scene analysis in that the elements change asynchronously and therefore should be split into separate bands. Here are the examples. This is the one band, okay? This is essentially an envelope match to speech. You could count the syllables, right? Okay. Here's 2 bands. Here are 4 bands. Everybody understand how this is being done? Yes?
Up to now, it sounds like there's only one is no.
Yeah, exactly. Here, see if you can tell what the phonetic properties are. Now, it's crucial to understand that this doesn't have a spectrum like whispering, even though it sounds so much like whispering. I mean, it's familiar. Right? It has a familiar quality and doesn't quite satisfy our requirement to block familiarity and typicality. It blocks typicality, but it doesn't block familiarity. Right? What does whispered speech look like? You see the same frequency variation in the vocal resonances. It's just that it's a turbulent excitation. Okay? But this is one. You can see why this is of exactly the same genre. Let me show you another. This is another form of vocoded speech that Bertrand Delgut calls a chimera. What he does is he analyzes the speech the same way Shannon does. He basically has a set of bandpass filters that report the energy in a region of the spectrum each moment, and then those values are used to gate the excitation within that band upon resynthesis. But instead of using a stationary driver, that is a flat noise band for his vocoder, what he uses is a non-stationary source of excitation. Who took the spectrogram reading course? Did anybody? What does this look like to you? There's a wonderful chapter by Potter, Cotton, and Green from the 40s in which they show spectrograms of everything. Here's what this original speech was.
Wood is best for making toys and blocks.
Did you get it? Okay. Here's what they're going to use to drive the vocoder. Okay. Are you going to hear the speech or not? Think about it, right? At any instant, you can't use the absolute level of amplitude to go fishing in your template book to tell what the segment was. It's got to be organized according to the ongoing progression of the driver of the vocoder. So some self-organizing process has to occur before you can recognize the speech, if you can.
Wood is best for making toys and blocks.
Did you get it? No?
Wood is best for making toys and blocks.
I think you could, I can do both at the same time. I can actually pick up the melody and recognize the driver, and I can also hear him say, wood is best for making toys and blocks.
But it's pretty clear it's Paul Desmond.
Yeah, well, you can, right. In fact, you can do auditory scene analysis on the driver and on the speaker. And of course, there are different ingredients that promote both process, or each process. So let's wrap it up. How does the listener know what the talker said? The acoustic particles turn out to be less relevant than we once thought, and the time-varying properties are adequate in the absence of natural vocal acoustic products. The perceiver appears to be sensitive to speech-like change in segregating a talker from a noisy background. That's how you actually find the talker. And time-varying properties that promote phonetic perception index the talker as well as the message. And that's all she wrote. Thank you. Yes?
Am I right in concluding that this puts the motor theory to rest? What I have in mind is that, you're showing that your synthesizer or the other synthesizers that you described form some kind of an equivalence class with the vocal track, but they form an equivalence class only in some acoustic space, that is in terms of spectral distribution. They do not seem to, at least so far as I can think, form an equivalence class in some mechanical space where you have resonating cavities, as you have in the vocal track. Is that about right?
Everybody got the question? Here's the problem with putting the motor theory to rest. In the original version of it, which was described in a paper in research report in 1958, the claim was that the listener, in order to identify the phonemes, was imagining the proprioceptive return from articulation. It was a kind of corollary, it was a kind of imagined reafference. Well, that didn't work. So then they tried a kind of corollary discharge. That is, what the listener was using to make sense of the speech signal was an imagined efferent process creating the articulation. Well, that didn't work, and the reason that it didn't work is that the articulation is as context conditioned as the acoustic properties are. So there was no invariance to exploit on the motor side to solve the problem of the inverse problem for the listener. In the most recent version of the motor theory that was published in 1985 by Liberman and Mattingly, the motor theory became a black box. That is, in order to protect it from evidence, it became a processor that was completely internal, in which the listener imagined the phonetic intentions of the talker. It became symbolic and maybe even Jacobsonian. So I think in some ways, the motor theory responded to the lack of corroborating evidence by retreating. And what you say is, about these studies is absolutely true. There's no common mechanical property that could give rise to each of these specific acoustic signals. What there is, of course, is a style of modulation indifferent to carrier. And of course, if we could describe the common properties in the modulation of the noise band vocoded speech, the non-stationary excited vocoded speech, the sine wave replicas, and the natural speech, then we would have solved the problem. And unfortunately, we can't do that. We just don't know enough. But my guess is that
The point is that the sounds that you're producing are not produced just by what would be just a regular vocal track changing the source to a sine
right,
source
that's
or
right.
to a
Yeah,
noise.
yeah.
So that's
Right. There's no mechanism that has this versatility. So I mean, the way we actually describe this is as a conversion from auditory to symbolic properties. And that's about as neutral a description as you can get. That's because we don't know how this is done. We just know that the elements are not, the natural vocal products are not required. The modulation is required. A speech-like modulation. Yeah.
This is, I mean, is this sort of the sinusoidal speech? Is that as speech-like as some portion of a Picasso image is bird-like? I mean, are you saying that I mean, what are we doing when we perceive that as speech? I mean, are you suggesting that we're not trying to fit this sinusoidal pattern to something that would be speech?
Yes, this is a great question. You have it? There, actually, the better example of this is the Italian Cinquecento painter Arcimboldo. Do you know? Anybody remember what his stuff looks like? Fruit face, right? The way fruit face works is that Arcimboldo made portraits. Fantastic. It wasn't just fruit. Have you seen the one that's fish? That's scary. What he does is he paints things that appear to be still lives, assemblages of fruit, but the fruit in aggregate produce the impression of a face. So there's one for autumn made of leaves and acorns. There's one for spring made of spring flowers. There's fish. There's winter. Right? And what happens is you identify at the same time that the salmon trout is the man's nose. You identify that, sorry, at the same time you identify that that thing with that pattern is the nose. You identify that it is the salmon trout. So you have the ability, because of the nature of the visual system, to say which element stands in correspondence, which element in one domain stands in correspondence in the other domain. The problem with making that argument go for the sine wave case is you have to be able to tell which aspect of the auditory form corresponds to the consonant property, which part corresponds to the vowel, which part corresponds to your impression of intonation. Now, what we were able to show to try to push this was that your impression of the weird intonation when you hear "Where Were You a Year Ago?" this is due to the dual use of the tone analog of the first formant as information about the height of the jaw and information about the pitch of the speech. You can actually make you can do it that way. But the problem is we couldn't make it go for the segmental properties. No one can tell us which aspect of the pattern corresponds to the segment. So because of that, I'm tempted to claim that it's different. It's not a matter of detecting the analogical properties between the assemblage of fruit and the assemblage of the facial anatomy. In fact, Well, I can give you a processing story, but in short and sweet, the answer is no, they're
Just to
different.
follow your analogy, though, I could draw a nose separately. I mean, I could parse a face into constituents. I could separate the nodes to identify.
You mean a real face?
Yeah. This is an eye piece, this is a nose piece, this is a mouth piece.
Right.
I might not do well if I turned it upside down and decided whether or not the pieces were properly oriented. But I'm pretty good at separating those pieces out. But as you demonstrated, I'm not very good at doing that with real speech, with the form and components of real speech. So the fact that I can't parse real speech in any way, shape, or form
That's right.
doesn't help you argue.
No, it makes me, but it does make me say that the sine wave instance is like the natural speech instance, right? That is the parsing that
identify the sign components in the sine wave speech. That you can identify the presence in a way that you can't do the same for the components of the speech.
But the parse that you get isn't the relevant one to the symbol sequence. It's about something else. It's about the way in which a primitive Gestalt-based auditory mechanism finds or parses concurrent acoustic properties into sound sources. Right? What happens with phonetic sequences, whether it's a sine wave manifestation or a synthetic or natural manifestation, is that whatever elements of this whatever elements of the auditory form you get, they are not coextensive with the symbol set. They have a different segmental structure. In fact, what we showed is you can get the concurrent items out, but what we want is the sequential items out. Right? The symbol sequence is in fact from prior to latter rather than concurrent. So what we get is the concurrent parse, not the sequential parse. And that, sadly, is that. It would be lovely if it turned out to be the case that there were some technique in which, by whatever acoustic ruse imaginable, it would be possible to say, this element in the auditory form evokes this symbolic property. If we were able to do that, we'd be able to work in the perception lab to solve the recognition problem. We'd be able to tell what actually matters perceptually. But in fact, what I think is happening is that as information is flowing, or as stimulation is flowing along the axis of the nervous system, there's an exit where the auditory form goes out. The phoneme sequence stays on the pattern stays on the interstate until it takes the exit for phonetic analysis. These two things report out. They produce qualitatively different impressions, and in fact, they are uncorrelated because they represent scenic turnouts at different locations along the same highway. Sorry, anyone from the English department would really find these metaphors stylistically objectionable. I'm sorry. I apologize to anyone with a real finely tuned sense of metaphor. Yeah, there was another question, yeah.
Well, I was curious about the results you showed of people classifying the speech of people that they knew, the altered speech of people that they knew.
Yeah.
What would happen if you snuck in there strangers, either people that they didn't know well or people from different dialect regions, or less desirable people?
Yeah.
And how did you measure desirability?
We didn't. It's just that's just the fact of social organizations. If we went around this room, we'd find that some of you speak well and others of you speak like I do. Right? I have a dialect of English that is valued lowly. Of course, it might not be so bad to have it if you're in a jam and you need to talk to a cop in New York. Right? But yeah, I don't know. We haven't actually tried that, and we barely scratched the surface. What we have shown in a study that's under review is that if you've given samples that are sine wave samples of a set of talkers, you can actually learn to identify particular individuals such that novel sine wave samples or natural samples of their speech are identified as the individual who you've become acquainted with simply by attaching a name label to a sine wave sample issuing from that individual. So, I mean, it's surprising that without any natural attributes at all, you can learn to characterize somebody based on aggregate phonetic properties. The project that we're doing now, to try to get a better handle on this, involves a set of studies in which we're looking both for talker effects and listener side effects. That is, we are collecting speech corpora now from dialectally homogeneous groups. Now, how do you identify these groups? I mean, I've been reading sociolinguistics, and of course I know I shouldn't be, but it turns out that adolescent females first begin to speak in a way that's characteristic of this negotiation between the properties of phonetic expression that the dialect group requires and the differentiation that's required for each individual to speak in a unique voice within the dialect. Right? You should see that as a tension. Right? If you capitulate completely to the dialect group, then you have no identity. So you have to reserve some things. And in fact, John Laver has shown that in any dialect group, Laver at University of Edinburgh has shown that in any dialect group that he's considered, there is no individual who manifests all the characteristics of the dialect. It's as if you're allowed a subset of all the dialect switches that are available within Glaswegian English or Edinburgh English or Aberdeen English, right? And once you've switched that last switch, you know, that sort of sets you. So our dialectically coherent group of teenage females comes from Bloomington, Indiana, Flatbush, Brooklyn, and Yorkshire. And we've got both spontaneous red speech and clear speech from actually from the Indiana and the Brooklyn girls. We don't have the Yorkshire girls recorded yet, but you can see that the possibility is to cross the listeners and to look at sensitivity that way, to have people listen within group, and then also to have outliers. California is the source of general American English now. You knew that. The isoglosses have prevailing westerlies. And before you know it, we're all going to be speaking like we live in the San Fernando Valley, especially if we keep going to the movies and watching television. Right? We should actually throw out our TVs and stop going to the movies if we want to preserve our regional culture. But we can have Californians who speak this sort of English listen across all of these groups. By the way, it's also corrupting British English. You knew that, right? Yeah, it's quite interesting what's happening.
Are you throwing out species specificity and perception with this, or are you just changing the rules that we have to postulate our humans are processing in a special way to perceive species?
Here's what we wrote. This was in the '94 paper, in which we attempted to say whether or not we were disputing a general auditory approach in favor of a speech mode approach that was a modularist approach, right? So we've got a speech mode, and we also have the species typicality argument in Fodor's modularity view, which basically says that there are these sort of input-output systems that are highly specialized, automatic, obligatory in their action, and speech is one of them, just like vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. What we said is we had falsified the adequacy of a general auditory-based approach for perceptual organization and analysis. And that, in fact, we knew we needed a mechanism that was sensitive to variation, independent of the elements undergoing the variation. Because most of the evidence supporting auditory scene analysis came from studies of audio frequency oscillators and noise generators in Montreal, studying experiments using these natural ingredients. We thought it's important to encourage our friends who believe in auditory scene analysis, and they actually describe it as a church. By the way, one of the acolytes of auditory scene analysis told me that he came from the Church of Auditory Scene Analysis. That it's important to encourage them to try natural cases. And so far, the only natural case that has been tried was by Paul Iverson, who tried it with the instruments of the orchestra, in which he found that it worked for some, like oboes, but failed miserably for flutes and clarinets. So basically the answer is, it's too soon to tell whether speech is like everything else or whether speech is like anything else. We really just don't, we don't know enough. I was encouraged to see that you need some story. You need an account that uses sensitivity to time-varying structure to account for clarinets. That's pretty easily answered, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of course, there's other evidence besides our evidence that there is specialized neural substrate in humans for perceiving and producing speech. So, luckily, the evidence doesn't. Luckily, the claim doesn't depend on my evidence.
Doesn't depend.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much.